This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today is going to be a video where I'm going to describe gospel authorship. Who were the authors? Matthew. And this video is mainly to basically deal with a discussion that's taken place in one of my videos concerning things I've said about the authorship of the Gospels specifically. So this is something I want to address in this video, and starting with the book of Matthew. I've discussed this issue that I consider to be, not just my consideration, but consider to be historical facts about the original Jewish Christians. And the things I've mentioned before is that one, their movement died out within 2 generations. And that's pretty easy to explain, meaning that there seems to be some element of historical information about there have been, having been a movement of people who were, what we would call today Jewish Christians. But then about 2 generations after their start, you don't find anything about them, meaning that you don't find any known communities where you can identify the people as being Jewish. You don't find any practices amongst so-called communities, that you can mark them as being Jewish with, and that you don't find names of any leaders, things like that. And what this basically would mean is that a person can't say, well, there were 12 disciples because the New Testament says so, and therefore that's who the witnesses are. No, what I'm talking about is that, okay, well, most of those 12 disciples are never described fully in the New Testament itself. But the New Testament is not the information that proves what was happening after the New Testament, for example. So when we look at history, we don't see any known identifiable Jewish Christians. And we'll see in just a second what I mean by that. The second thing is that the numbers of the dedicated, members of this group couldn't have been anything more than 1,000, and probably even less than that. For the same reason that within 2 generations, if they're gone, it couldn't have been that many people who were involved in such a movement. And you can also take into account that, okay, if there's such a movement and it was so powerful, then you would have had a Jewish presence, up until the present era. You would have had a continuous movement of, these people that, for example, had a group, were having children and then passing those traditions on to their children. And that's something that you don't see. And that's what I mentioned in the third point. Their children not continue in their ways, meaning that if you say, okay, well, the 12 disciples are the witnesses I want to go by. If a person wants to say that, and then you say, okay, well, after those 12 disciples are gone, their children could not be identified as being leaders of this movement, then that tells you something. And then the same thing, if their grandchildren are not leaders of any type of movement and can't be identified. And if in the modern era, there's no one who can even claim to be a descendant of the original Jewish Christians, that tells you something. And then the last thing is that they did not leave behind any known writings in Hebrew, Aramaic, and when I say or Greek, what I mean by that is something that we can positively say based upon the text itself, that the text identifies its author as having been someone who was actually Jewish. So that's what I mean by that. And of course, I know people are going to try to debate that, but I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that. So if we look at the time frame, this is the time frame I've showed in other videos, but I've adjusted it a little bit right now, and I'll try to put an annotate on so I can show where I'm adjusting it a bit. So, for example, if we look at historical claims, we have a claim that the Torah was given at Mount Sinai during a certain period. And then, after the return of Jews from an exile, there's the Second Temple period. Now, during that period, which I'm kind of playing loose here with how I represent the time frame of it, because it's kind of hard to put into a time frame. If we look at manuscripts, writings that we find from the time periods, that we want to analyze, we first have to look and say, okay, well, the original Jewish Christians, as I said before, died out within 2 generations of their start. Anything that we have currently in writing can only really be traced back to the non-Jewish movement, and that can even be somewhere between about 200 to 300 CE, and you could maybe give or take, but most of the documents we find in this area, or all of them that we find actually in this area, are New Testament documents or fragments that we find in Greek and only in Greek. As no one currently can show you a text that that's in Hebrew, that is a gospel or something that can be identified as one of the gospels. So we only find fragments of this, and I've talked about this in other videos, but I'm going to show a part of one also that will kind of back up what I'm saying here. And then the full New Testament manuscripts, in Greek, same as in Greek, we only get that about 400 CE. Again, with any carbon dating of something, you'd have to kind of give it, give or take maybe a couple decades or so, or whatever. But from the same token, we have letters that are written in Hebrew or in Aramaic that are from the Bar Kokhba revolt that span from 132 to 135 CE, which actually identify the author of the actual writing itself. And then also, as I mentioned in a previous video, we have the Mishnah being around somewhere between 200 to 300 CE. Okay, so this is the time frame of what I mean. Because again, if we look, we know Pauline Christianity basically took over what became known as Christianity, and that led into the origin of the Catholic Church, for example, being the oldest form of modern day existing Christianity. So this is what we're talking about here in terms of time frames. So when we want to talk about who was the historical Matthew, for example, the first thing that we have in terms of even, some form of identification is we have a text that is identified as being a small portion of Matthew, a fragment of Matthew, and that, comes from around, 150 CE, potentially. And then, we have like, a part of a, a kind of a flyleaf, as they call it here, that actually, mentions Matthew, but it doesn't mention it in terms of its like, for example, authorship. What it all basically says is it's the Gospel of Matthew. It says that in Greek here, for example. And, essentially what that means is that, this is dated somewhere, this particular part of it is dated from somewhere from the second to third century. Okay, and it's the earliest manuscript that has the title Matthew on it. But again, the title never says the author is Matthew. It just simply says this is the Gospel of Matthew, meaning that anybody could have simply written it and said that it was the Gospel of Matthew. But in the fragment itself, there's no mention that I, the author Matthew, or I, Matthew, such and such, am the author of this text, or I, Matthew, am writing these things to you, blah, blah, blah. Those things are not in the text. So, we have to take it as it is. Here's a fragment, that dates from about 150 CE. And here's a fragment that has like Gospel of Matthew on it from a different time frame. But still, neither one of these or tell us anything about the actual author itself of any meaning. Because as you can see here, this fragment only can be, only covers about what modernly is called Matthew to like, chapter 21, 34 through 37, and only in fragmentary, format, for example, never giving us any details about who the actual author of that particular fragment was. So, in conclusion, concerning this fragment, we know the author of the text does not identify himself by the name Matthew. Further, we know that the title of the text appears to have been applied by someone else somewhere around the third to fourth century CE. Maybe even a little bit earlier, you could say. But again, what I'm getting at is that, what we want to look at is we want someone to be able to show us that, they themselves identify themselves as a Jew and as the author of the text. The information in the fragment does not identify any historical details about Matthew, meaning that there's nothing there to say that I, Matthew, am this type of Jew in this area, and I, know Hebrew, Aramaic, blah blah blah. I grew up in this background. I learned Torah from this individual. None of that is in the fragment, and the fragment doesn't contain anything identifying its author as being Jewish or even a Jew of valid background or scholarship. So that's a historical given, and that's not me making up things as that is. So when we look at the Catholic Encyclopedia, in order to try to understand, for example, who exactly the Christian, I guess, the oldest forms of Christianity considered Matthew to have historically been, I look at this because of the fact that Catholicism is the oldest form of surviving Christianity. There is no other form of Christianity, and they supplanted what initially would have been a Jewish movement, of the levels that I mentioned earlier in the video. So, in terms of this encyclopedia, what it says is that, I'll put my annotate on. One second. So Matthew is spoken of 5 times in the New Testament. And then, just going forward, for example, it says the man designated in Matthew 9:9 as sitting in the custom house and named Matthew is the same as Levi, recorded in Mark 2:14 and Luke 5:27 as sitting at the receipt of custom. So I would ask the question, okay, well, where in the New Testament, the Gospels, does it say that this is the case, that these are the same two individuals? But, okay, fine. That's according to oral Christian tradition, and I stress oral Christian tradition, this is the case. And maybe it's written somewhere in the New Testament, but so be it. It still doesn't give me hardly information about the individual we're talking about here and how I know for a fact that he's Jewish, given that this is written in a Greek text, for example. And it says, hence Levi was the original name of the man who subsequently called Matthew, The Mattathios Legonomos of Matthew 9:9 would indicate this. So continuing in the article, it says Matthew, the son of Alphaeus, Mark 2:14, was a Galilean, although Eusebius informs us that he was Syrian. Okay, well that's a pretty big jump. Is he Syrian or is he Galilean? Which one is it? In terms of him being the son of Alphaeus, who's that? Who exactly is this individual? In terms of if I go back and look at Jewish communities from the Second Temple period, well, who's this? This doesn't tell me really anything that, makes me understand that this is someone I should even listen to, especially given the fact that this gospel is written in Greek and it doesn't identify the author as being this individual here. Meaning that I would expect that if you want to be 100% clear that the authorship is being claimed to be this Matthew, that somewhere in the text the author would say, "My name is Matthew, son of Alphaeus," or something that says, "And Matthew, son of Alphaeus, wrote this document," for example. But of course, that doesn't exist in the text, which is why one of the reasons that there are scholars who say that the Gospels are anonymous, because the fact within the Gospel itself, it doesn't identify the author. It may, as we saw earlier, identify that this is the Gospel of Matthew, but it never identifies that the author is Matthew, for example. Maybe someone can say, "Well, I heard this from Matthew, and I wrote down what I think I heard from him." But why? The question would be, why in Greek? If he was a Jew, and if he was so knowledgeable, why didn't he just write it in Aramaic, or Hebrew of the time? We'll see in just a second. There's other documents from his time frame where people were writing in Aramaic and Hebrew. So if we go a little bit further down, skipping some of the internal New Testament information about the claims that are being made here, it says no further allusion is made of Matthew in the Gospels, except in the list of the apostles. So again, that doesn't provide any real information for someone who's like saying, "I want to fact check this information." I mean, and again, it's not simply a matter of, okay, well, the Christian churches say that this document was authored by Matthew. I, as a Jew, would be looking for a Jew to tell me that, from the time period or whatever, that the author is this individual. He's a Jew from this place, this region, and that he learned Torah from this individual, and this is someone that's reliable to listen to because he was respected within his community. This information tells me nothing that can help me out as a Jew to know exactly who we're talking about here. So then if we continue, in the article, it says of Matthew's subsequent career, we have only inaccurate or legendary data. And then it continues with some of that inaccurate or legendary data that comes from, further, Christian sources, not Jewish sources, non-Jewish Christian sources. And it says further in what I highlighted here, ancient writers are not as one as to the countries evangelized by Matthew, but almost all mention Ethiopia of the south of the Caspian Sea, not Ethiopia and Africa, and some Persia and the kingdom of the Parthians, Macedonia, and Syria. Now, what I would even say is, okay, well, let's take a look at this. If we go and look at from Jews from these regions that is being said that Matthew supposedly went and he evangelized to, well, who exactly do he evangelize to? Did he evangelize to non-Jews? And if so, who? But I mean, even beyond that, okay, there are Jews there. Do any Jews have any stories about an individual named Matthew writing this particular text that exists today and is called Matthew? No, none of it exists. There's no Jewish community that attests to this information. So a person can't say, well, the other disciples attest to it. That's an internal thing. There's no Jews on the outside who attest to it. And in fact, if one were to say, okay, well, there's only 4 Gospels, if he's only attested to in a couple of places, like 5, and none of them attest to like who exactly he was, well, then we can't say there's a lot of information from the Jewish community that attests to this person. We can only say that these documents, which have no known Jewish, authorship, especially given that they're written in Greek and things like that. Well, again, I don't, I don't have to take this as something that's, a proven thing. And one of the things that often happens when I bring this up is somebody wants to say, well, in their words, the Old Testament doesn't, but the Old Testament has nothing to do with what we're talking about this text here. If someone were to come to me and challenge me about the Tanakh, I wouldn't go and say, well, the Declaration of Independence doesn't have the Declaration of Independence has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Let's stay on topic. And I don't have a problem with people who don't agree with the authorship of the Tanakh, none whatsoever. I have no problem with someone saying I don't believe that Jeremiah wrote Jeremiah. I don't say that he did either. So, the information is about Jeremiah. It doesn't mean that Jeremiah wrote it. And there's no reason that he had to have written it. We lose nothing or gain nothing from him having written it or not written it. It's just simply an account of something that happened during the time of Yirmiyahu. That's, and that's a lot of text in the Tanakh. So that's one of the things this one person brought to me when I started challenging these things in this way. And he was like, well, you could say about the Tanakh, the Old Testament. I'm like, well, that doesn't mean anything. I don't have a problem with like someone saying that Chronicles wasn't written by somebody. It was written by someone. It doesn't matter who. Just the information's a historical account. It doesn't matter, exactly who wrote it. It's just there. It's just there for like a historical purposes so that Jews have an idea of what things were, taking place or considered to have taken place during a certain period. And you could have a lot of room for interpretation in that area. So that's not a problem at all. So what this means to me is that when you deal with the scant details about Matthew, well, pretty much it's derived from oral non-Jewish Christian tradition. Oral, meaning that this stuff isn't really written down in a format that is a Jewish format. It's not written in Hebrew. It's not written in Aramaic. If there or were such documents, they don't exist right now that people know about. There's nothing in hand that exists anywhere that can go back and trace itself to a Jewish point of view, and also a Jewish authorship describing this individual known as Matthew. And therefore, the details of the information, you know, are, considered to be Christian in nature and not something that's Jewish in nature, even if it discusses topics that are Jewish in nature. And second of all, there's no details that exist about whether Matthew learned Torah, and if so, from who. Because again, there's nothing in the historical content of the text by itself, without the oral Christian tradition, that points to anybody named Matthew being the author. But second of all, there's no proof that even if you want to assign it to whoever the author was, there's no proof that that person learned Torah. And the question would be, well, if they learned Torah, from who? Because again, the text is written in Greek, but the Torah is in Hebrew. And we know for a fact that Jews in the Second Temple period understood enough Hebrew, and the ones who didn't, could learn, who knew Aramaic, and could still learn from people who knew Hebrew, and the Hebrew was the primary text, not Greek. So then the next thing is, there's no evidence that shows Matthew knew Hebrew or Aramaic. Because again, if he did, why did he write in Greek? And again, this is not exactly a question, it's just a statement, because I already know, why that is, because again, whoever's writing it could write it to a non-Jewish audience, and the audience would have no way to fact check the information in it, because they wouldn't have known enough about the Hebrew language or Aramaic or the region that's even been talked about. And number four, no evidence that Matthew was known within the Second Temple Jewish communities and was respected as a knowledgeable Torah-based Jew exists. So that's the basic issues there. So let's take a look at something. Because I had one person bring up to me that, like when I was challenging this issue of, the New Testament being written in Koine Greek. And the reason I was challenging it was because of the fact that this is not a national Jewish language, Koine Greek. So it made no sense for someone who's trying to convince Jews to believe in this event to have written it in Greek when they were trying to convince Jews. I mean, it makes sense if you're trying to convince someone who's a Greek-speaking non-Jewish person, because again, that speaks to them. But the fact that none of it exists in Hebrew or Aramaic says something. Now a person could claim, okay, well, like the person said, well, how do you know that no Jews understood? Are you claiming that no Jews understood Koine Greek? And I was like, no, I didn't say that. What I'm saying is that it's not a language that was, nationally recognized as a Jewish language, and in fact, it at one point was the language of a certain group of oppressors of the Jewish people who, were influenced by Greek Hellenized thinking, and it was more of the language of the Hellenized Jews who were not ancient Torah-based Jews for the most part. So let's look and say, okay, well, if we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find Hebrew text and Aramaic text and some Greek text within the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we predominantly find a lot of Hebrew and Aramaic stuff. So, for example, if you look at the community rule, which or the rule of the community as it's called, it comes from around 107 BCE, which is prior to the New Testament. And if you look and see this document is written in Hebrew. Further to this point, if you look around the 132 to 135 CE, you have the Aramaic Bar Kokhba letters, for example. And I think some of them actually have been in Hebrew too. But someone could say, well, how do you know that this was written by the person you claim was written in? Well, right here. If you look at this particular word here, it says Mishimon. Mishimon means that it's from a person named Shimon who's writing a letter to someone else, for example. So this identifies who it is. Now you could argue, okay, well, how do I exactly know definitely that Shimon wrote it? Well, again, the fact that it at least has inside of it from Shimon, the author, and it was going to someone, and we know about who the author is, the Jewish community does at least, that tells us something. And then we further find the same situation in another letter from the same time period where it says again, Mishimon. Mishimon, is from from Shimon. Shimon is a name. So we know again, same situation that this comes from a person Shimon. Now, whether or not the person authored the text, and just simply, having a messenger transmit it, that's fine. It doesn't hurt anything that that's the case, but at least we know who we're talking about here. So someone receiving this would have known who it came from, where in the other situation we were talking about, we don't know anything about the author at all. So I cover more details about these issues in a particular playlist that I have. And, again, I've said this before. The main point of this is not to really beat up on Christianity. It's mainly to address this from a Jewish point of view, so that Jews who, are being bothered by missionaries or, Noahides that, are maybe questioning certain things, that, you can look at the historical background of certain information. And it helps with this idea of the question that some people have is, why don't Jews believe in Christianity? And the reason is simply because we're not supposed to. There's no evidence that leads us to takes any of the things in it seriously. But again, if someone who's not Jewish, if that's what they want to do, then that's fine. We're not, Jews aren't out missionizing to the world, trying to convince the world to do something it doesn't already want to do. I mean, the basic issue is that this is not for Jews, and this is that something that the Torah warns Jews to stay away from, and that's what we're supposed to follow, and each to his own, if you will. But this is one of the things that I wanted to cover in this video, and I'll may cover some of the other gospels maybe. I think pretty much the details are going to be about the same, that within the gospels themselves, they don't identify the actual authors. Now, the authorship is, of course, attested by oral church tradition, which is the oral non-Jewish, church tradition, predominantly from the Catholic Church or the Church Fathers. That's a historical fact, and you can't get around it. And again, trying to bring up a Jewish text and say, well, maybe I don't believe in your text, that's fine. So the person who brought this up to me, my thing is that that's fine. You don't have to believe in the Hebrew text. You don't have to believe in anything that comes out of the Jewish community. Believe whatever you want. But in terms of Jews who don't, buy into this, there are a lot of reasons why, and predominantly they're historical reasons. So I hope this helps. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Take care and bye.